Welcome to Tribal Jazzman Scholar. It's time for some ancestor stories. Let me adjust this. My grandmother, Margaret Mackenzie Astin, she told me stories my whole childhood and then all the way up into my adult life. She passed away 87 years old, and I was in my 20s. And she told a lot of stories, and she told stories about her grandmother. So I'm going to tell a couple stories about Jemima Midgley, who in 1856, as a young woman, made her way across the Rocky Mountains to Utah. She was a pioneer to Salt Lake City, a Mormon. My grandmother did not grow up in the Mormon church, but her grandmother was a Mormon, and her grandmother raised her. And my grandmother, Margaret, used to tell me some stories about Jemima, and I'm going to share a couple of those in honor of the ancestors, because ancestor stories are important. They help us connect to our past in a way that isn't just dry history, but is living, tangible ancestors. It also connects us to Earth, because those ancestors lived, breathed on this Earth. They loved, they married, they parented, and they died as sentient beings on the same planet with me, albeit long before me. So I connect both to my past and to my own Earth in a sort of strange, interesting cycle by relating stories of ancestors. So Jemima Midgley had a garden, and she raised all kinds of interesting plants in her garden. She had an interest in unusual plants from areas of Utah, different altitudes and different subspecies. And so she had this interesting garden, and she would bring my grandmother, Margaret, into the garden as a child, and they'd work together. And one day, my grandmother, Margaret, saw a cactus-looking thing. It was a plant covered in spines, and she was startled by it. It was kind of ugly and dangerous looking, and she said, "Grandmother, what is that?" And Jemima turned to her and said, "Margaret, go ahead and touch the leaves. Run your fingers across those leaves." And Margaret said, "No, I couldn't do that." She says, "Margaret, go ahead and touch those leaves. Feel those leaves." So Margaret reached her hand out, and as she says, "And I ran my hands across those leaves, and they were as soft as they could be." And I said, "Grandma." And my grandmother said, "Margaret, there's a lesson in that for you. Some people you meet in life, when you first see them, they're going to look all thorny. But if you just reach out and touch them, you realize they're as soft as they can be." That's one of my grandmother's stories. And another one that I wanted to share was, at that time in the Mormon church, a man who had enough of an income, enough resource base to support a large family would take more than one wife. They were a polygamous group, the Mormons, back in the 1800s. And but there was an understanding in the church that if you wanted to take a second wife, you had to get the permission of the first wife. That was generally pro forma, but still, it was a tradition and it was honored. And my grandmother Jemima's husband, Joshua Midgley, was feeling ready to take another wife. So he brought the elders of the church by. That was always a powerful way to impress your partner, your wife, to have the elders come speak. So the elder men from the church came and said, "Jemima, Joshua feels ready now to bring another wife into the home and grow the family, help build the church, and we wanted to get your blessings if we could, Jemima." And my great-great-grandmother said, "Gentlemen, let me pray about this." And the elders, of course, what could they say to that? They left, and they came back a few days later, and they said, well, Jemima, have you reached a decision?" And she said, "Gentlemen, I've been praying to God about this since you left, and so far he hasn't said anything about bringing another woman into this house." And that's one other ancestor story of Jemima. And the final one I'll tell is the local senator from Utah. Being a small town, and the senators were the representatives to Congress from that area were Mormon, because the population was largely Mormon. He had come to town, and he was speaking at the church that morning, and it was always a big deal, and people would line up to greet him, and everybody knew everyone, but he was a pretty important man. So he got to my great-great-grandmother Jemima, and he said, "Jemima, tell me, how did you like my talk this morning?" And Jemima said, "Well, Senator, it's important to know when God speaks through a man. And it's important to know when a man is speaking. And this morning, a man was speaking." And that's all she said. And these are some stories that my grandmother, Margaret Mackenzie Astin, told me. and I share them here in honor of the ancestors. Thanks for listening to Tribal Jazzman Scholar.